I stood in the parking lot of Whitfield Funeral Home with my car keys pressed into my palm, cold enough that November, and I listened to my brother tell a security guard that I wasn't family anymore. "She's not family. Keep her out." Loud enough for the mourners near the door to hear. Loud enough for our father's neighbors, his old co-workers, the woman from his church, all of them turning slightly, the way people do when they want to look and pretend they aren't. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I checked my watch instead. 4:52 in the afternoon. I had a folder in my car. Manila, unremarkable, the kind you'd overlook in a stack of 100 others. My brother didn't know it existed. He didn't know what our father had signed 3 weeks before he died, or why the last page of that document was going to change the shape of the next hour of his life. I'm not going to tell you what was in that folder yet. Not because I want to keep you waiting, though I do. Because you won't understand why it mattered until you understand what it cost me to have it. So I'll tell you what I told myself, standing there in that parking lot, keys in my hand, watching my brother smile at a man he thought was protecting him. The last page changes everything. But to understand why he never saw it coming, you have to go back to the house I grew up in. Quick word first, if you're new here. This channel doesn't tell stories about people who won by shouting the loudest or by burning everything down in front of an audience. We tell stories about people who won quietly. People who kept records when no one asked them to, who waited when waiting cost them something, who understood that the truth doesn't need volume, only proof. Listen the way a jury listens. Not to decide who's likable. To decide who's telling the truth, once all the evidence is on the table. Today's story is about a woman named Alina, an insurance claims investigator who spent her whole career learning to spot when a story and its paperwork don't match. This is Alina's story, and like all of ours, it starts with what people assumed about her. My name is Alina Torres. I'm 48 years old, and for 22 years I've worked in claims investigation, first for a regional carrier, now for one of the larger national ones. My job, in plain terms, is to find out when a story doesn't match the paperwork. A car that supposedly rolled at low speed with damage that says otherwise. A fire that started in a room with nothing flammable in it. People are good at telling stories. Documents are better at telling the truth. My family called this being cold. My brother, Daniel, used to say it at Thanksgiving, in front of whoever would listen. Alina doesn't feel things, she audits them. He'd laugh when he said it, and everyone would laugh with him. And I'd sit there doing the math on how many times he'd said some version of that sentence in the last decade. I never answered him. I filed it. What nobody in my family ever seemed to notice was who actually did the work. When our father's blood pressure medication needed adjusting, I was the one who sat in the exam room asking the doctor follow-up questions. When his pharmacy switched to generic without telling anyone, I was the one who caught it, 3 days in, from a change in his color. When he needed someone at 6 in the morning for a cardiology appointment 40 minutes away, I was the one already dressed. Daniel visited on holidays. He brought good gifts, a cashmere robe one Christmas, a bottle of scotch our father never opened. He'd stay 2 hours, tell our father he loved him in a voice loud enough for the room, and leave before the dishes were done. Nobody in the family kept a record of who showed up on the Tuesday afternoons that didn't matter to anyone but the person living through them. I did, but only because it was habit by then. Professional instinct, misapplied to my own life. There was no document anywhere, no agreement, no letter, nothing signed, that said I was the one responsible for our father's care. It was simply understood, the way things get understood in families that prefer not to write anything down. I did the appointments. I did the medications. I did the calls to specialists at 8 in the morning before my own workday started. And Daniel did the holidays. Nothing about that arrangement existed on paper, which professionally should have worried me. Let me be precise about something, because precision is the only thing I have to offer you here. This isn't a story about a woman who wasn't loved. My father loved me. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest, because the rest is going to sound like the opposite. I was the helper. Daniel was the heir. Nobody announced this arrangement. Nobody sat us down and assigned the roles. But by the time our mother died, when I was 31 and Daniel was 34, the pattern was already set, the way a fracture sets if nobody resets the bone in time. I was the one who called our father every evening at 7. Daniel was the one whose calls our father bragged about to his neighbors, because Daniel called on birthdays, and birthdays are memorable, and Tuesdays are not. For 6 years I watched my father's decline in installments too small for anyone else to notice. A missed word here. A stumble on a curb there. I adjusted my schedule around it the way you adjust a budget around a fixed cost, quietly, permanently, without complaint, because complaining wouldn't change the number. When his heart failure got bad enough that leaving him alone for a full day felt like a risk I wasn't willing to take, I requested a leave of absence from work. 10 weeks unpaid. My manager approved it with the kind of sympathetic face people give you when they don't understand what it's actually going to cost you. I didn't tell my family the leave was unpaid. I don't know why. Maybe because I already knew how that detail would be used. It was used anyway, just aimed a different direction. Daniel's wife, Renata, started saying things at family dinners in the specific tone people use when they want a comment to travel without their fingerprints on it. "It's interesting," she said once, over a dinner I had cooked in a kitchen I had cleaned, "how someone just happens to move in with a sick parent right when there's an estate to think about." She smiled when she said it. She always smiled when she said things like that. I didn't respond. I finished plating the food. I noted, the way I note everything, that Renata had never once been alone in a room with my father's medication schedule, his cardiologist's number, or his actual physical decline, and yet she had opinions about my motives that she delivered with more confidence than I'd ever heard her use about anything true. It was at that same dinner, 3 weeks before the hospitalization, that Daniel said the thing you should hold on to, because it comes back later, and when it does, you'll recognize it. He'd had 2 glasses of wine. He was leaning back in his chair, the posture of a man who has never once worried about being believed. "Family takes care of family," he said, looking at Renata, not at me. "The real family, anyway." I remember the exact silence that followed it. For seconds, maybe 5. Nobody corrected him. My father, who was sitting at the head of the table, said nothing either, though I saw something cross his face that I filed away without understanding it yet, a kind of stillness, the look of a man doing arithmetic he hadn't finished. I didn't argue with Daniel. I've never found arguing useful in situations where the facts are simply going to arrive on their own schedule. I cleared his plate along with everyone else's. I drove home. I wrote the date down in a notebook I'd started keeping without fully admitting to myself why I was keeping it. 6 days later, my father collapsed in his kitchen at 11 in the morning, alone, and was found only because I'd set up a habit of calling him at that exact hour, every day, for the past 4 years. The hospital called it a cardiac event. I called it the end of the part of this story where anyone had time to pretend. The hospital kept my father for 11 days. I took a second leave, this one shorter, and I spent those 11 days doing what I've done professionally for 2 decades without ever once applying it to my own life. I started building a file. Here's the honest reason. It wasn't suspicion, not at first. It was habit, the same reflex that makes me photograph a claimant's garage before I've decided whether their claim is legitimate. You document first. You decide what it means later. So I photographed his medication schedule, taped to the inside of his kitchen cabinet, in his own handwriting, dated, and initialed the way I'd taught him to do years earlier for exactly this reason. I saved the discharge instructions. I logged the names of every nurse and every cardiologist who touched his case, with dates, because that's simply what 22 years of training does to a person standing in a hospital hallway with nothing else to do with her hands. On the 9th day, my father was lucid in a way he hadn't been since the collapse. He asked me to bring him his phone, and when I stepped out to get him water, he left me a voicemail. I still have it. I'm not going to play it for you in full, but I'll tell you what he said, because it matters later. He thanked me. He said my name twice, which he rarely did. And near the end, almost as an aside, he said, "I'm making some changes, Alina. Don't be surprised." I didn't ask him what he meant. I've learned, in my line of work, that people volunteer their most important information when you don't chase it. I saved the voicemail to 2 devices and an email draft, the way I'd save any statement from a claimant I suspected might not be available to repeat himself later. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I think of it that way now. Daniel, meanwhile, was busy in a different direction. On the 7th day of the hospitalization, I got an automated alert from my father's bank, one I still received because I'd been listed as a secondary contact years earlier, back when Daniel had no interest in being bothered with such things. The alert flagged a balance inquiry on an old investment account my father rarely touched. Then, 2 days later, another one. Then a call log, forwarded to me by accident from my father's phone, showing Daniel had spent 11 minutes on the line with the bank's estate planning department while our father was still in a hospital bed 3 miles away. I didn't confront him. I filed the alerts the same way I filed everything else, dated, saved, unremarked upon. Daniel has never in his life felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He expects to be believed the way some people expect the sun to rise, without evidence, without effort, simply because it has always been so for him. He wasn't hiding those calls. He didn't think he needed to. At the time, none of this felt like building a case. It felt like doing what I always do, which is notice things and keep them. I had no idea, sitting in that hospital hallway with a phone full of screenshots, which of these small, unremarkable records would end up mattering more than all the others. One of them would. I didn't know that yet. What I did know on the 10th day was that I needed to call someone who'd known my father longer than either of his children had been alive. His name was Walter Greer, and he'd been my father's attorney since before I was born, the kind of lawyer who still kept paper files in a cabinet behind his desk, in a small office above a hardware store that had been there since I was in grade school. My father trusted very few people completely. Walter was one of them. I called him on the 10th day, mostly to ask a practical question, whether there was a healthcare proxy on file, something I needed for the hospital. Walter answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting to hear from someone in our family, if not necessarily me. He confirmed the proxy. Then there was a pause on the line, longer than the question warranted, the kind of pause I recognized professionally because I've made that same pause myself right before telling someone less than I know. "Alina," he said, "your father came to see me 5 weeks ago. Alone. He made some changes." I asked what changes. He didn't answer that directly, and I didn't push because I understood in the way you understand another careful person that he was telling me exactly as much as he was allowed to tell me, and not one word more. "I can't discuss the details with you before he's gone," he said. "That's not how this works, and you know that better than most people would." A small compliment, folded into a boundary. Walter had always been efficient that way. What he did say was this: "Whatever happens after, however it happens, be at the funeral. Don't let anyone talk you out of being there." I asked him if there was something I should be worried about. He said only that he'd known my father for 40 years, and that my father had never once in that time done anything without a reason, even when the reason took a while to become visible to everyone else. I thanked him. I wrote the date and the gist of the call into my notebook, the way I'd write down a claimant's statement before I had any evidence yet of whether it was going to matter. I didn't get much more time to wonder about it. For days later, at 11 in the morning, my father's heart stopped for the last time, faster and quieter than any of the doctors had prepared us for. I got the call at 11:40 that morning, from a hospice nurse whose voice had the practiced gentleness of someone who has made this exact call more times than she'd probably like to count. I remember the time because I looked at the clock the way I always do, a reflex from 22 years of documenting the moment a claim begins. By 1 o'clock that same afternoon, Daniel had already called the funeral home. I know this because when I called an hour later to ask about viewing times, the woman who answered the phone said, "Oh, your brother mentioned you might call. He said he's handling everything, so we can just work through him." She said it kindly, without any idea what she was actually telling me. Handling everything. Neither of us had seen a will. Neither of us had spoken to Walter since the morning our father died. There was no document in existence, as far as either of us knew, that gave Daniel more authority over our father's arrangements than I had. And yet he had already positioned himself, within 2 hours of our father's death, as the one making decisions, the one funeral homes should route through, the one whose name went on paperwork. I didn't call him to correct it. I've never seen the use in correcting a story before I have something to correct it with. What I did instead was quieter, and it told me more than any argument would have. That evening, another bank alert came through on my phone, the same account Daniel had called about during the hospitalization. This time it wasn't an inquiry. It was a transfer request submitted online for an amount just under $10,000, initiated at 6:14 p.m., 5 hours after our father died and 3 days before anyone had read a word of his will. I didn't say anything about it to anyone. I took a screenshot, the way I'd taken a screenshot of every other document in this file I hadn't yet admitted I was building. I noted the time. I noted the amount. I filed it next to the voicemail, next to the call log, next to Walter's careful pause on the phone. 2 days later, I drove to Whitfield Funeral Home for the viewing, in the same navy dress I'd worn to our mother's funeral 17 years earlier, carrying nothing but my keys and a folder I'd started keeping in my car without quite deciding to. I didn't make it past the parking lot. Here's something I've wondered about ever since. If you'd been standing where I was standing, in a parking lot, in a navy dress, listening to your own brother tell a stranger you weren't family, What would you have done? Would you have argued? Walked away? Stood your ground and said nothing, the way I did? Tell me in the comments. I read all of them, and this particular part of the story tends to bring out the most honest answers. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment to do it, before we get to the part with the attorney, because what happens next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Now, back to that parking lot. The funeral home had a young security guard stationed near the entrance, the kind of man who looked like he'd been hired for parking in traffic, not for turning away grieving daughters. I saw Daniel intercept him before I'd even reached the door, one hand on the man's shoulder, leaning in close the way people do when they want to be quiet and overheard at the same time. "That's her," Daniel said, nodding toward me, loud enough to carry across the lot. "She's not family anymore. Keep her out." The guard looked at me, then at Daniel, then back at me, the way people look when they've been handed authority they didn't ask for and don't know how to use. He asked, not unkindly, if I could wait outside. I said that was fine. That wasn't surrender. It was arithmetic. I had a folder in my car. I had a voicemail on 2 devices. I had a call from Walter Greer still fresh enough in my memory that I could recite it back word for word. Daniel had a security guard and an audience. Those aren't the same kind of asset, even if only one of them is visible from a parking lot. I saw Renata near the entrance, in black, holding a tissue she didn't appear to need, watching the whole exchange with an expression I can only describe as satisfied, the specific satisfaction of someone who believes a story has finally landed the way they always intended it to. Behind her, I saw my Aunt Cece lean toward a cousin and whisper something, and I saw the cousin glance my way with the particular pity people reserve for someone they've already decided has lost. I didn't go back to the door a second time. I let it go without raising my voice, without asking the guard to reconsider, without giving Daniel the scene he seemed to be waiting for, the one that would let him tell people afterward that I'd made it ugly. I walked back to my car instead, opened the door, and sat sideways in the driver's seat with my feet still on the pavement, keys in my lap. For seconds. Maybe 5. That's how long I let myself sit with it. The plain physical fact of being kept from my own father's casket by my own brother, in front of people who had known me since I was a child. I felt something cold settle into my chest, not anger exactly, something quieter and more durable than anger. Then I picked up my phone and called Walter Greer. He picked up on the second ring. I told him where I was standing and what Daniel had just said, and to whom. I kept my voice level, the way I always do, reporting facts rather than performing distress, because facts were the only currency I had any use for in that moment. Walter didn't ask me if I was all right. He didn't ask me to describe how it felt. He asked only one question. "Has the will been read yet?" I told him no. Nobody had read anything yet, I said, and Daniel had already had a security guard tell me I wasn't family, standing outside a funeral home 15 minutes into a viewing I was apparently no longer allowed to attend. There was a silence on the line, and then Walter said, "Stay exactly where you are. I'm coming." He arrived 19 minutes later, in a gray suit I recognized from my mother's funeral, carrying a slim leather folio under one arm. He didn't stop to speak to me first. He walked past my car, up the steps, through the front doors, into a room full of people who had just watched my brother remove me from it. I followed him inside. Nobody stopped me this time. I think the sight of Walter Greer, a man most of them had known for decades, walking in with the particular gravity of someone carrying unfinished business, made the guard forget his instructions entirely. Walter stopped near the casket, in front of my father's photograph, and asked in a voice pitched to Carrie whether Daniel Torres was present. Daniel stepped forward, already smiling the smile he uses when he expects an audience to be on his side. Then Walter asked for me by name. "Alina Torres," he said. "I need you here as well." I watched Daniel's smile hold for exactly as long as it took him to register that Walter hadn't asked for him alone. I watched Renata's tissue stop moving. Walter opened the folio. He explained briefly that our father had come to his office 5 weeks earlier and executed a final codicil to his will, signed, witnessed, and notarized, superseding certain provisions in the original document. He said he'd normally handle this privately in an office days from now. He said the circumstances in the parking lot had changed his mind. He read it aloud. The codicil named me sole executor of our father's estate. Not co-executor. Not executor with Daniel as a check on my judgment, the arrangement everyone had always assumed, if they'd thought about it at all. Sole executor. My father had written, in his own words, read aloud now to a room that had spent the last 20 minutes watching me stand in a parking lot. That this decision reflected who had shown up, who had kept his medications straight, who had sat with him at 7 in the morning at cardiology appointments no one else attended, and who, in his words, has never once needed to be watched. Then Walter read the second provision. All prior distributions and provisions naming Daniel Torres as co-executor or financial agent were revoked, pending a full accounting of financial conduct during the period of the decedent's incapacity, specifically referencing account activity in the 90 days preceding his death. The room had gone very quiet. I felt it rather than saw it, that particular stillness that happens when 40 people simultaneously decide not to look at each other. Walter reached into the folio and produced one more page, a bank record he said had been provided to him that morning by the estate's financial institution, standard practice once a death is reported and an executor is named. It showed a transfer request, initiated from Daniel Torres's linked access to our father's dormant investment account, submitted at 6:14 p.m., 5 hours after our father's death, 4 days before this viewing, in an amount just under $10,000. Walter read the timestamp aloud, once clearly, and said he was entering it into the estate file as of that moment. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I'd had that same figure, that same timestamp, sitting in a screenshot on my phone for 4 days, filed and dated the way I file everything, waiting to matter. Daniel's smile was gone entirely now. I watched something happen to his face that I can only describe the way I'd describe a claim collapsing under its own weight, not suddenly, but all at once, the moment the numbers finally stopped cooperating with the story built on top of them. Daniel started talking before Walter had even closed the folio. That account is mine to manage, Dad set that up years ago, I've had access to that since. He stopped, because Walter was looking at him with the mild, waiting expression of a man who has heard 100 versions of this same sentence and knows none of them finish well. Daniel tried again. It was going to be split anyway. I was just moving it before probate made everything complicated. That's all this is, that's. He'd told the funeral home an hour earlier that he was handling everything. He'd told the security guard I wasn't family. Now he was telling a room full of our father's oldest friends that a $10,000 transfer, submitted 5 hours after our father's heart stopped, was simply him being efficient. Nobody in that room needed to be a claims investigator to notice the two stories didn't match. Renata reached for his arm. He pulled it back, still talking, explaining a version of events that kept revising itself in real time, each new sentence quietly contradicting the one before it. I recognized the pattern professionally before I recognized it personally. It's what people sound like when they're building an explanation out of nothing, in front of you, because they never expected to need one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, and more than that, I didn't want to. Somewhere in the last 4 years, I'd stopped needing Daniel to understand anything in the moment I explained it. I only needed the room to understand it, and the room already did. I waited until he ran out of sentences. It didn't take long. You said it yourself at dinner a few weeks before he died. I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use when I close out a file. Family takes care of family. The real family, anyway. I let that sit for a second. I did. I have the records to prove it. I didn't say it to wound him, though I understood it would. I said it because it was true, and because I'd waited a long time for a moment where saying it would actually mean something, instead of just being true and unheard, the way it had been at every dinner table for the last 6 years. Daniel didn't answer. There wasn't an answer available to him that wouldn't make things worse, and for once, he seemed to know it. I could have let the room finish what it had started, the whispering, the accounting, the slow public unraveling of a man who'd spent his whole life assuming he'd never have to prove anything. Part of me, the part still standing in that parking lot 15 minutes earlier, wanted to. But that part isn't the one my father wrote his final page for. I'm not interested in a scene, I said to Daniel, quietly enough that it wasn't for the room anymore. I'll be filing a full accounting with Walter of everything on both sides. If you cooperate with that, this stays between the estate and the two of us. That's not for you. That's the last thing I'm doing for Dad. Daniel didn't answer right away. He nodded, once the way people nod when arguing has finally stopped being useful to them. The room, slowly, went back to being a funeral. The accounting took 4 months. Daniel cooperated, in the end, once his own attorney looked at the timestamps and told him, in language gentler than mine but pointed in the same direction, that there wasn't a version of events left to argue for. The $10,000 was returned to the estate in full. The rest of the estate was distributed the way my father had written it, in a document that had been sitting quietly in Walter's office for 5 weeks before anyone else knew it existed. I still have the folder. The medication schedule, photographed and dated. The voicemail, saved on 2 devices and in an email draft I'll probably never delete. The screenshots, timestamped down to the minute, of a transfer request submitted 5 hours after a man's heart stopped beating. I never raised my voice through any of it. Not in the parking lot, not in that room, not once in the 4 months after. I didn't need to. I'd already done the part that actually mattered, years earlier, in exam rooms and pharmacy lines and 6 a.m. phone calls nobody else was awake for. The rest was just paperwork, arriving on schedule, the way paperwork always does for the people patient enough to have kept it. My father used to say I audited things instead of feeling them. Maybe that's true. But I've come to think that keeping the receipts is its own kind of feeling, the long, unglamorous kind, the kind that doesn't perform itself at a dinner table, and doesn't need to. If you've ever had your own version of that parking lot, a moment where someone tried to write you out of a story you'd actually built, tell me about it in the comments. I'd like to hear it.